Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I hope you all can hear. If you do not hear, please tell us in the chat box on your right. It's good afternoon in the East Coast, but my presenter is not from the East Coast, and it is just barely afternoon there. And I know we have people who have joined from the Pacific coast, as well as farther east, farther west. So good morning to all of you. We are going to wait a few minutes for people to join, but I want to make sure everybody can hear. So I am going to send you look at your chat box. So it's, can you hear me? And if anyone can kind of write, if you do not hear me, then that will be fantastic. Okay, so we got a lot of people already joined in. So if anybody is having any difficulty hearing us, please do let us know. So we'll give it one more minute and we'll get started. So we have, so I'm assuming everybody can hear. So let's get started. So my name is Rathin Sinha. I'm the founder of JOBfindah Network and the moderator for today's webinar. I'll make the introduction, and time permitting, obviously take questions and pass them to our guest speaker. As we go through this, we would see that today's webinar is being hosted and organized by JOBfindah Network. Many organizations across the country use JOBfindah for easy to use job posting, distribution, outreach, and reporting for federal contractor compliance, OFCCP compliance, and diversity recruiting. In addition, businesses use JOBfindah for custom-built recruitment marketing and technology. Our solution, many of you use also, it does include job postings on the diversity job boards for diversity recruiting, on the state job boards for mandatory job listing, outreach to the state organizations, the community job organizations, and then full reporting of posting, distribution, and support. As you know, our industry is changing quickly, and so with new technologies and new regulations, continuous learning is critically important in our field. So today's webinar is focused on learning and not for selling any products and services. Our topic today is OFCCP Audits and Enforcement, change rules and change strategies for success. And our presenter is Mickey Silberman. He's the founder, shareholder of the law firm Silberman Law PC. Mickey has been a regular presenter on many occasions on our webinars. And for more than 25 years, Mickey has represented management in all areas of employment law, specializing in systemic EEO, affirmative action, OFCCP compliance, and audit defense, pay equity, and diversity and inclusion. Mickey has overseen the preparation of thousands of affirmative action plans, and he has directed the defense of thousands of OFCCP compliance evaluations and systemic discrimination investigations. This high volume of audit defense keeps him on the cutting edge of OFCCP's evolving enforcement trends. He often is asked to step in to defend audits and investigations gone wrong, and has a strong track record in those audits. We'll make a copy of the presentation as well as recording of the webinar available within 2 days. Please also note that this webinar is approved for 1 hour of HRCI credit. We'll send the detailed information on how to obtain credit to the attendees in follow-up communication. So with that, I'm going to give it to Mickey for the presentation, and I'm going to also give basically hand over the keyboard and make Mickey the presenter going forward.
All right, Rathin, thanks so much. And I'm changing to my screen now. Let's make sure that I'm doing this right. Excellent. Rathin, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Very good.
Okay.
Are you able to see my screen now with my bio?
Yes.
All right. Well, then let's have some fun. Folks, wow, what an interesting time we're living in. What an interesting time we are dealing with. The challenges that come along with the weeks preceding an election, and not just any election. This is big. And around the issues of equal employment opportunity, affirmative action, diversity and inclusion, recruitment. In fact, I know many of us on this call focus particularly around the area of outreach and recruitment and the staffing process. Your work and our work more broadly in the area of EEO and affirmative action is very much top. It's in the crosshairs. It is front and center. And I want to show you some things literally that are just going on in the last couple of weeks from the current administration, from the White House itself, from the OFCCP that impact our world. But as part of that, why don't we jump ahead? Before we go into any of the detail, here's the lawyer's disclaimer. Here goes. I'm the lawyer. I'm going to share with you cutting edge legal developments and best practices for how to respond. But this is not legal advice unless I work with you and you are my client, in which case it is legal advice and you can follow up with me and we can continue to chat about it. Anyone else, we can still continue to chat about it, but here's the point. Don't take this as legal advice. Bring this back to your expert in your organization. You may be that expert. If you have counsel that you work with inside or outside the organization, make sure that what I'm providing to you, particularly best practices and strategic recommendations, make sure they make sense in your world. Don't just stamp them on your staffing or recruitment or compliance process. So with that in mind, I want to give you just, let's do our overview of what we're going to chat about. And then we're going to deep dive into a couple of areas that are very specific to OFCCP compliance and that also are much more broad than that, but have an immediate real world impact on you and on me. So we're going to chat about just a level set. Rathin had suggested, and I think it's a good idea, every once in a while, it's good to go back to basics and say, even for the experts here on the call who've been doing this for many years, it's good to step back and get a big picture. What affirmative action is and what it isn't for compliance purposes. We're going to talk about
1 minute.
Yes,
Mickey, sorry, just one question thing. If you can reduce your that menu on the side and make the slide a little bit bigger, I think we'll get the full screen. Maybe just me, but yeah, if you can.
You know, Rathin, I put it in slideshow mode and I'm in full screen. So here, let me see what I do. No, that's okay. Does that help?
Yes, for me.
Okay. And now I'm going to go back into slideshow mode just so I can show it with the animation. Let me make sure that I'm doing this right. Okay, from current slide. Okay, I think this should work. Hopefully, we'll see in a moment as we get to some animation. Bear with me if you could, folks. Let's see, from current slide. There we go. All right. So, and Rathin, again, if the visual isn't working for you, then it's probably not working for other folks. So let me know. We're going to chat about affirmative action, but what's right off the press, I mean, the ink is not yet dry. Some of you on our call have heard about this. OFCCP has sent letters, and they've gotten tremendous publicity to, this is a matter of public record, Wells Fargo and to Microsoft in response to their publicly announced diversity goals. and the efforts they're going to make in that regard. One of the themes we're going to chat about throughout our session today is doing diversity right and how easily you can do diversity wrong. And so some of this is political as we near an election. Certainly some of it is motivated by a current administration that is in some ways skeptical of or questioning affirmative action and diversity. And interestingly, it's at a time when there is tremendous momentum around diversity, inclusion, and equity, as well as affirmative action because of the death of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, social justice developments over the last several months that have brought most organizations, corporations, nonprofits, and so forth. I would put this in a summary of they're off the sidelines. They've gotten off the sidelines, most of corporate America, and have made very clear statements about their support for diversity goals, and for enhancing the opportunities and the results for, in particular, African Americans, but also more broadly for people of color. So just a day or two ago, literally 2 days ago, Starbucks announced with great fanfare their enhanced diversity program, where they announced that after doing, and this is important, we'll get to this in just a few minutes, after reviewing their availability, meaning who's actually available to fill their jobs, Starbucks announced 200,000 employees in the US, guys. Starbucks announced that they have a target of having 30% of their corporate workforce be people of color, and they defined that as both African American, but also Hispanic, Asian, and those who are not identified as Caucasian. At least 30% is their goal by 2025 in the corporate office, and nationwide for all of their retail and other locations, their goal is 40% people of color by 2025. Just a few weeks before that, the OFCCP, most of us know our friends at the OFCCP, that's the agency that enforces affirmative action and EEO obligations. Just a few weeks before that, OFCCP sent letters, as I mentioned, to Wells Fargo and to Microsoft, challenging them on their announcement of diversity goals. And it's fascinating. Folks, I want to break it down here for a moment so we can have some context as we go through the detail. Wells Fargo announced on their website and put out announcements in other ways a month or two back that their intent, after they reviewed their diversity program and their desire to enhance it and get better results, Wells Fargo said, I want you to think about the practical implications of this. They will double the number of African American employees in management by 2025, and they will tie managers' compensation to their achievement of those goals. So without knowing more, what Wells Fargo said, and Microsoft announced something publicly very similar, without knowing more, Microsoft and Wells Fargo appeared to set hard targets that they had mandated internally they will achieve, and that managers' compensation is going to be tied to the achievement of it. Without more information, that starts to sound not like an aspirational goal or objective. Instead, it sounds like a quota. We are going to double the number of African American managers within the next few years, period. We're just going to do that. There's no discussion in their announcements about who's qualified. How are they going to identify these African Americans? Will other people who are not African American, will they lose out on management opportunities because of this mandate? And will managers make decisions not based on qualifications, but rather based on a target or even a quota, and their motivation is to do so, or they will lose compensation as a result of it? Without knowing more, OFCCP's letters, and these were not compliance reviews, they did not initiate these because of a complaint. This was literally the OFCCP, at the direction of the White House, doing searches on websites of large companies, or it was otherwise brought to their attention in some way, and they initiated an investigation and said, in essence, and I have the letters that have gone to Microsoft and to Wells Fargo. They're now a matter of public record. If you're interested in seeing them, let me know, and I'll email them to you. Without more, what the OFCCP said is, the law does not permit you to hire an African American into management because they're an African American. It permits you to engage in robust, diverse outreach efforts and recruitment and feed the pipeline with qualified candidates. And by tapping into sources of diverse talent, you can feed that pipeline with more diverse qualified candidates. But then ultimately, we expect you to select the most qualified person. And Microsoft responded by putting out an extensive blog post, it's for all to see, where they basically said to the OFCCP and the world, we do exactly that. We conduct analyses, we determine where our statistical underutilization is. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then we set goals based on those who really are available. We're doing everything in concert with the law, but we also have set very robust and aggressive targets for using that qualified candidate pool, that diverse pool. We're going to use it for purposes of achieving these diversity goals. I'm going to come back to that and put that in the context particularly of you, people who are involved in recruitment, staffing, and how you use and at times misuse diversity outreach, diversity recruitment, and diverse information about your applicants. This falls under the category of getting affirmative action done right or done wrong. You can get it done right. Many of us at this point are taking shortcuts. If we're just trying to achieve a diversity goal, we've been given that mandate by the C-suite in our organization. We're going to talk about how to do this right. In addition to the letters that went out from OFCCP, again, this is in the context of the last few months of an administration and in their election campaign, where they have said very clearly, we think many in our society have gone overboard in response to BLM and George Floyd and racial justice issues. I'm not telling you that that's the case, but I'm telling you it's clear from the administration's multiple steps they've taken. They are making I don't want to be cynical about this, they're making this both a campaign issue, but it's also bigger than that. It's an ideological issue for this administration. So just a few weeks ago, September 22nd, President Trump signed a new executive order. It affects government contractors. And it says that in your diversity training, if you train on implicit bias, if you say that America has a history of systemic discrimination, folks, there's no getting around the fact that on the day our country came into existence, slavery existed and existed for another 80 years. But the administration has said in this new executive order, if your diversity training includes calling out the US as a racist country, as a discriminating country, including its history, or if you say that there are certain races or sexes, let's say white male, that have been the dominant race and gender in our society, and that there has been racism that has emerged from that dominance versus other groups. That's a very common part of diversity training. The president has said OFCCP is going to be charged with taking complaints, investigating your training programs, and potentially debarring you from government contracts. This is a big deal. And again, this falls under this concept of diversity done right or diversity done wrong. And we will talk again about strategies and best practices for how to do this. But then we're going to drill down into the OFCCP itself over the last year or two, because OFCCP has been, by every traditional measure, more effective than they've ever been before. They've brought back more money, tens of millions of dollars. more money than they've ever brought back before in 2019. They're still tallying up their numbers for 2020. Their fiscal year ends on September 30th. So we're just a couple of weeks removed from that. So we'll see numbers, but we know their numbers are going to be huge. When you get audited now and in the near future, it is critical that we crack the code. What has OFCCP done recently that has given them this entry point into investigations that have brought back so many huge multi-million-dollar settlements? I mentioned Wells Fargo. Oh, the poor folks at Wells Fargo, I don't envy their position. This is your damned if you do, damned if you don't. They got the letter 2 weeks ago saying you're going overboard with your diversity goals, but OFCCP also has been investigating them, a matter of public record, for the last many years throughout the company. And Wells Fargo just recently entered into a settlement for $7.8 million that has to do with their hiring, their outreach, and the recruitment process. So on the one hand, they were compelled to enter into a settlement that concluded that there was systemic discrimination against Blacks and other minorities in their hiring process. And then they also, a few weeks later, get a letter from the OFCCP saying you appear to be going overboard in your robust diversity programs. So there's a damned if you do, damned if you don't element to it. We're going to try to find that middle ground to thread the needle between them and talk about best practices. And then finally, I want to talk about strategic disposition codes. That actually becomes pretty critical for us as we think about what Wells Fargo just entered into. I have a lot of cases going on where the OFCCP is very aggressively going after hiring discrimination. And what I've seen as a pattern is that you're doing a decent job with your applicant tracking, a decent job with your disposition codes, but we can be a lot more strategic in a way that's going to protect the organization. So why don't we start with 5 minutes on just what affirmative action is and what it isn't. And let's start with who is a government contractor. Well, we are. In fact, most entities, for-profit, not-for-profit, universities, large corporations, small corporations, it's hard to be in the business of making money in our society and not get that money in some form, directly or indirectly, from the federal government. So I'm going to use an example. IBM sells computers to the Navy. That's easy. IBM is a direct contractor with the federal government. You and me, we sell product to IBM. You sell the keyboards for their computers that go to the Navy. I'm a specialist. I'm your vendor, and I make space bars. But I make the best space bars in the business. You know those space bars on a laptop computer where the tension, when you click it with your thumb, the tension is just right. It is perfect. It does exactly what you want. I sell space bars to you, which you need in your keyboards, and you sell them to IBM, which IBM needs in its computers, and they sell to the government. All of us are government contractors or subcontractors because we are producing products that are necessary to the government contract, and we are deriving revenue from that. The logic behind all of these affirmative action rules is that if you are a contractor or subcontractor, you are getting America's dollars. I'm not getting your dollars by selling you my space bars. I mean, I am technically. You're not getting IBM's dollars, even though you are technically. IBM gets paid by the Navy, and guess what? The Navy doesn't make any money. They don't sell anything. Rather, it's our tax dollars, America's tax dollars, that go into the money that the Navy uses to then buy the computers, which in turn buys the keyboards, and in turn buys the space bars. All of us are getting America's dollars, and in essence, the big idea in the area of affirmative action and government contractors is this. Because we are getting America's dollars, the government expects us to hold ourselves to a higher standard than simply traditional, what I call reactive EEO. So let's define some terms here. What does affirmative action really mean? The best way to think of affirmative action is the difference between reactive and proactive EEO. And what do I mean by that? Let's first define it by reactive. All employers have an obligation not to discriminate. If they discriminate on the basis of race or gender or anything else like that, they are violating the law. And how does that generally come up? Well, an employee or a former employee or a rejected applicant claims that there is discrimination. They bring a claim to the EOC or OFCCP. They bring it internally to your HR department. They file a lawsuit against you. And in all those instances, hopefully, we react. Someone alleges that they've been discriminated against, maybe themselves or a big class of females, let's say. And then hopefully we investigate. In essence, affirmative action requires a shift in that approach to proactive EEO. And what proactive EEO says is this: don't wait for the claims to come. Instead, you, as an employer that's taking EEO to the next level, you should seek to uncover and address EEO issues before any claims are brought. On an ongoing basis, we should be gathering data, which you do, from applicants, hires, your employees. You should be gathering data about race and gender and other characteristics, and you should be examining what I call the employee life cycle to determine if there are hidden barriers to equal employment opportunity. Now, just think of the life cycle as every stage. Literally, think of it cradle to grave in your organization. How do people find out about our jobs? And is there appropriate diversity? Are we casting the diversity net wide in recruitment? How do people apply and how are they considered? How do we hire people once they come in? What's their starting pay? How do we figure that out? How do people move up within the organization throughout their time with us and the pay increases they get? And then finally, how do they leave us? That's the employee life cycle. And we as the employer make a series of decisions throughout that life cycle that either provides equal employment opportunity or it doesn't. The premise behind affirmative action is not to grant preferential treatment to Blacks or to females or other protected groups. That could be what OFCCP saw in that announcement by Wells Fargo when they said, we are going to double the number of African-American managers within the next few years, without any discussion of qualifications or otherwise. That appears that could be discrimination in favor of protected groups. Guess what? Whites and males are protected just as much as minorities and females are under the law. So this concept is, don't wait for the claims to come. Instead, shift to a proactive approach, gather data and analyze it on an ongoing basis to see if you can uncover these hidden barriers that may exist at each of these stages in the employee life cycle. The key takeaway here, and then we'll be done with the basics, is under the government contractor, as government contractors, under our obligations, we actually have two obligations. They're the ones in italics here. We have to both not discriminate. That's actually the first and most basic obligation. Do not discriminate in your employment process on the basis of race, sex, and these other characteristics. But then we also have an obligation to take affirmative action for minorities and women specifically, and also the disabled and covered veterans. How do we balance? How do we strike that balance? And particularly, how does it impact our recruitment, our outreach, our hiring process? All right. One last piece just to think about how we lawfully undertake affirmative action. Take a look on the left side. Externally, diversity-focused outreach, targeted recruitment, college recruitment, the work that Rathin does in his organization. You have an obligation to list your jobs with state employment services and ensuring that you do that in all the states you operate. Other ways, job fairs and so forth. Internally, what can you do and should you do to ensure EEO and everyone has the same opportunity? Training, job rotations, high visibility assignments. One thing that I've worked with a lot of employers on over the last year or two is going beyond just traditional mentoring and structuring more formal sponsoring and champions types programs that guarantee that as we bring minorities, females, and others into more senior professionals, management roles, supervisory roles, that they are given, it takes a village. They are given a team of people who are going to be there to help them transition in, deal with the new roles they have, do it in a way that they really feel welcomed and integrated and part of a team. In fact, one of the things that Wells Fargo and Microsoft said is, and Starbucks just 2 days ago, we will structure more formal mentoring, sponsoring programs to ensure that individuals feel that they are integrated, supported, and have what they need to succeed. Take a look at the right side. The bottom line is this: employee selection decisions in all instances must be based on qualifications and job-related reasons without regard to these protected characteristics. Now, it almost feels somewhat contradictory. You have to be race and gender blind in making your hiring decisions, promotion decisions, and so forth. But at the same time, you need to focus intently on appropriate diversity outreach and recruitment and training and mentoring. So on the one hand, you need to focus on diversity. You need to be aware of it. You're not race and gender blind when it comes to everything you're doing on the left, but when it comes to the ultimate decision making, you should be simply selecting the most qualified individual. One last thing I want to touch on before we're going to deep dive in one or two areas is, and this is critical for folks who are involved in outreach and recruitment. OFCCP changed its regulations about, now it's 6 years ago or so, that said the measure of your outreach and recruitment, or what we call good faith efforts under OFCCP's regulations, the measure of your compliance is not what I call the push out effort. Rather, it's the pull in effectiveness of your effort. And for a long time, many of you on the call who've done this for 10 or 20 years, you have, for the longest time, done it the way I did it until recently, which is I'm going to get a bunch of different diversity recruitment sources. I'll either do that through JOBfindah, or I'll do that through another third party, or I'll do it myself. I'll get a list of diversity recruitment sources. I'll make sure my jobs get pushed out to those. And then when I do that, I put my hands on my hips, and in a satisfied way, I say, my work is done here. I have gotten my jobs out to the world. Here's the list of 20 diversity recruitment sources I use. But the question is, how effective are those efforts? Do they pull in qualified, diverse candidates into your pipeline so that you can then make race and gender blind decisions, disability and veteran blind decisions too? But because you have fed the pipeline with diversity and qualified diversity, now simply by selecting the most qualified person, you're going to be fine. The OFCCP regulations that changed 5 or 6 years ago, and it's taken several years for, right? We always have a couple of years lag time in the data we're submitting. If you get audited today in October of 2020, you're giving data from 2019. And OFCCP also can and often does go back 2 years, so 2018. So the point is, even though the regs changed several years ago, we're only now beginning to see the rubber hit the road in terms of this. But what the OFCCP says, and the regulations back them up, is you employer, are you on an ongoing basis assessing the effectiveness, not just engaging in outreach and recruitment, but what is the pull and effectiveness? How many candidates did you get from that recruitment source? Were they qualified? Did they succeed to interview or ultimately to hire? Well, I have 2 different veteran recruitment sources. I listed my 30 job openings last year with both of them. I can prove that I listed all of them. If the measure is just push out effectiveness, those are equally effective. But one of the vets recruitment sources gave me no applicants at all, and the other one gave me 30, 15 of whom made it to interview, and 5 of whom made it to hire. Even though they're both effective as recruitment sources to receive my openings, only one of them is effective in feeding the pool with qualified candidates. This is a critical piece for you in the recruitment or staffing space to know the measure of your effectiveness is going to be looked at by OFCCP as the pull in, not the push out. So that's something I want you to be aware of. Now let's talk briefly about OFCCP's Big Numbers. By the way, You can put questions in the chat. We're going to leave a couple minutes at the end, and we'll review those. OFCCP, I mentioned last year, brought back the biggest number they ever have, $41 million. This year, they're still tallying it up, but it looks like that number is going to be the same, or it's going to be larger than that. These are by far the biggest monetary numbers. The question is, what is OFCCP doing differently? And frankly, what is it that you need to be aware of cracking the code so that you're not one of the poster children? You're not the $7.8 million settlement with OFCCP as Wells Fargo was just a few weeks ago. What can you do to protect your organization? Well, I'm going to tell you that your job groups, which have remained largely unchanged, think about how many years you've been doing your affirmative action plans annually, and every year you take out the data, you put them into the same job groups. Well, those are not static, or at least they shouldn't be static. And what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is OFCCP has begun using your job groups in other areas that they historically did not, and they're using them against you, and they're using them with great effectiveness. So the outcome of this part of our conversation is, I want you to think carefully as an outcome of this webinar of reviewing your job group structure and strategically revising it. I'm going to show you an example of that. But first, let's briefly go through the history. Job groups are fascinating. We don't create job groups. It's not from our HRIS system. It's not from our comp system. It's not from staffing or recruitment. Job groups are foisted upon us by OFCCP regulations going back decades now that said you need to roll up your jobs that are similar. So that's what job groups really are. They're aggregations of similar jobs, similar content, wage, and opportunity. Why? Because OFCCP is trying to get to a minimum sample size. Let's say you have a location with 350 employees and you have 35 job titles for your 350 employees. That gives us an average of 10 employees per job title. OFCCP is in the business of looking at systemic trends. Just like I said a moment ago, we should be looking for hidden barriers at each step in the employee life cycle. OFCCP wants to take your data for the full year. They want to aggregate your hires, your promos, your terms, your applicants, and they want to do statistical analyses that tell us whether there are indicators, whether there are statistical red flags for, let's say, African-American employees or applicants. And in order to get that, you need a sufficient sample size. The groups that I gave you with an average of 10 employees, those titles generally are not large enough to allow sample size to emerge. I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second statistically. When OFCCP first mandated, and this is many decades ago, the use of job groups in your affirmative action plan, it was used for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to establish affirmative action placement goals. What does your availability look like, right? Who's truly available? We know this for those who work on your affirmative action plans. We look and see who's available internally and externally. And let's say we establish a goal of 19% for females in our entry-level management job. That 19% goal is not pulled out of the air arbitrarily. That's exactly what OFCCP was concerned about with the diversity targets that Wells Fargo and Microsoft had announced, that they appeared to just be arbitrary targets or quotas. That's unlawful. What is lawful is looking at who's truly available and then establishing percentage goals. That's what your job groups are for. But over the last couple of decades, we've seen a steady job group creep, if you will, into areas of adverse impact analyses. I'm going to show you an example. And more recently, and very troubling, into pay analysis. I want you to think of those folks who you consider to be similar for pay purposes in your organization. It may be your grades, it may be your broadbands, your market reference points. I'll tell you what it isn't. It's not your job groups. And your job groups were constructed years ago or decades ago in a way that allowed us to get to large sample size to set affirmative action goals. We most definitely did not have the idea of pay analyses comparing all of those people within the job group. And yet that's what OFCCP is using. That is their entry point that has gotten them these great results, monetary results in audits. So wait a second. You've created job groups way back solely for the purposes of affirmative action goals, but now it's being used against you for hiring, promos, terms, pay practices. Well, the OFCCP is in fact doing that. They're using that as their default unit of analysis in all of the different analytics at each stage in the employee lifecycle. Remember, I showed you starting pay before, salary adjustments. I showed you promotions and hiring. This is their unit of analysis. And while your job groups, which are often quite large, number of employees with dissimilar jobs, while your job groups may be good for their original purpose of conducting utilization analyses and establishing goals, they are most definitely, as they're currently structured for many of you, overbroad if we're really thinking of who's truly comparable for pay and for hiring purposes. Here's the good news though. Well, the bad news is you haven't changed your approach. It's still the same job groups. They remain unchanged for the last several years. For many of you, they remain unchanged from decades ago. And it's resulting increasingly in audits, it's resulting in false positives, showing that there's an overbroad statistical result. OFCCP then says, aha, there's discrimination against Black folks, or there's discrimination against females. And only then do you say, well, hold on, our job groups are broad aggregations of jobs that are not entirely similar. But it's often too late at that point, because then the OFCCP says, I get it, you're arguing away from these results because you don't like them and you can't defend them. But here's the good news. You can, and you should, as a takeaway of this discussion, you should strategically review your job groups and revise them. The bottom line, and I'm going to show you an example in a moment, is in order to anticipate these investigations by OFCCP that now look to your job groups for groupings to compare for pay, for hiring, for promotion, for termination, when you have a job opening, folks, do you post the job internally and externally as we're hiring into a job group 702, please apply here? None of you do that. It's all based on the actual job itself. And yet when you give data to the OFCCP and when they analyze it, it's rolled up into these broader job groups and they use that in your hiring process. And I'm going to give you an example. The bottom line here is restructure your job groups to be more precise. They're usually going to be smaller, but the key is they're going to be putting together jobs that truly are similar and appropriate to compare, and it's going to avoid these false positives. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, first, I want to just show you a quick version of what many of you have heard me say in the past: big numbers are bad numbers. When you aggregate job groups into big groupings, you get statistical flags that OFCCP then uses to focus intense investigations and make findings against you. And let me show you. I'm going to guide. All of this is the same. Here, I'm going to cheat and give this away. Look at the first 4 columns. It's all female and male. It's all going to be the same selection rates for females. Let's look at the first line. 50 females applied throughout the year. 1 of them was hired for a 2% hiring rate. 50 males applied. 5 of them were hired for a 10% hiring rate. We use something called the 80% rule. The female selection rate is 20% of the male selection rate, so it doesn't satisfy the 80% rule. We go further and use what OFCCP really uses nowadays to find flags. That's the standard deviation analysis. Here's the good news. We're less than 2 standard deviations. There's no further investigation. If we were in an audit and we gave in this data, OFCCP would analyze it, find less than 2 standard deviations, which just means it's a tipping point statistically, where a statistician will say beyond 2 standard deviations, we would not expect to have this disparity in the hiring rates. Maybe gender is actually playing some role in an illegal way. But look what happens on the next line. All we've done is we've multiplied the numbers by 10, but we still get the same result. Instead of 50 females, we have 500. Instead of 1, we have 10 hires. We still have a 2% hiring rate. We still have a 10% hiring rate for males. And so we're still 20% on that 80% rule test. But now, because of big numbers, we're at 5 standard deviations. What happens below? in your overbroad job groups. Well, we still have the same hiring rates, 2% and 10%, but now we've put all of our professionals together in one job group, and we hired 100 females, 500 males out of those numbers that you see below, and now we're at 16.8 standard deviations. That would be a huge kick me sign on your back. You've slapped it there yourself, and now the OFCCP is going to do a deep dive investigation. Where did this come from? Well, here are your overbroad job groups. And they weren't overbroad when you were doing it just for purposes of setting affirmative action goals. You put all your senior officials and managers together, 63 employees. You put all your junior managers together, 97. You also had 2 levels of professionals. Senior professionals, 184, junior with 114. We're going to focus on that junior with the 114. Well, let's see. Last year, we hired a total of 50 professionals into those junior ranks. 13 were black, 37 were white. You can see the breakdown of applicants of about 2,000 or so, a little more, 2,400. Black folks were hired at 1%, whites were hired at 3%. We don't satisfy the 80% rule, and we have 4 standard deviations, well above the 2 standard deviation tipping point. Well, we talked about our officials and managers. In strategically revising our job groups, we've actually now broken them down into 6 different tiers. This more accurately reflects, first, how people really move up in the organization. Supervisors don't move straight up into vice presidents. They've got to first move up into managers, senior managers, and so forth. But what we've also done is we've put together employees who are much more appropriately compared. I'm more comfortable with you comparing the hiring trends for your vice presidents and the pay trends for your vice presidents, and doing it completely separately for your senior managers or your supervisors. But this is the really interesting one. We have so many professionals that we've reimagined how to put these job groups together. We're not just putting together more slices at a hierarchical level like we did in management. We've broken these up into what I call functional cylinders. And the cylinders allow us to put all of our scientific professionals together, and our IT professionals and our corporate professionals. Watch what happens, folks. We now have created a functional cylinder of 3 hierarchical levels. And now when you're looking at pay or hiring or setting goals, this is a lot more realistic to say all scientific professionals, 1, the junior level, they belong together at 43 employees. The middle tier belong together. Now, the scientific professionals, they're different than corporate professionals and how we pay them. So let's break out these 3 different functional tiers, and let's also, the functional cylinders, and let's also break them out into 3 hierarchical tiers based on how people come in and then how they promote within the organization. You have now gotten to a much more real picture of how people come in and move up into different functions and then move up within those cylinders. And what you've also done, watch this, is you've also now just cleared your statistical flag. That same group that had 4 standard deviations, we've now broken it up into 3 different levels of professionals. Here are your junior professionals. And now look at the analysis column. We have corporate, we have IT, and we have scientific. We've taken those same applicant and hire numbers that produce 4 standard deviations, and now we have broken it down into their appropriate functional area. And now, even though look at the hiring rates and rate for black and rate for white. Whites are being hired at higher rates, and we are not satisfying the 80% rule. But because we've gotten down to smaller and more precise groupings, we don't hit standard dev of 2 or more anywhere. Folks, this is cracking the code. And in your next OFCCP audit, or when you prepare your AAPs, let's say you have a January 1 affirmative action plan, I strongly recommend that you review this for these purposes. This will bring you up to date with how OFCCP is currently using your job groups today against you, and it gets to a much more real picture of who's similarly situated, appropriate for pay or hiring comparisons, and it will avoid those false positives that we looked at just a moment ago that have allowed the OFCCP to reach $7, $8, $10 million settlements just in the past few years for the first time. All right, I want to spend 5 minutes on one last piece that I think is very important. Because of these big flags that we're seeing in hiring, I thought we would dust off our disposition codes. We've used them for the longest time, but many of you, while they're technically good disposition codes, they're not strategically good. And here's the way I'd like you to think about it. We create disposition codes really not as an end in themselves. We don't track applicant flow as an end in itself. Many of those in staffing and recruitment and ATS system maintenance, that's the way we tend to think of this is, oh, we got to track this, track the race and gender, track the disposition code for why they did what they did, and then put it in the system and then we're done. No, that's not true. Applicant tracking isn't an end in itself. It is instead, the purpose of it is strategic. It's to tell us why, if we do have a flag like we looked at just a moment ago, why we did what we did. And that's the key. Why did we make the, not what did we do, but why did we make the decision to reject that black applicant and hire that white applicant? And by the way, I'm not talking about you telling me why the day after you did it. Remember, audits focus on applicant data from 2 or 3 years back. You in a recruitment role will be in a different role. You've promoted into something higher. You're no longer in that role, or you've left the organization. Look at the bottom bullet. Strategic disposition codes, if they are done right, are designed to tell us years later what the recruiter or HR or hiring manager was thinking, even though they're no longer in the role or in the organization. So let's think about purpose of disposition codes. Truly strategic disposition codes are going to tell us when an individual came in and then fell out of the process. Why did they fall out? This is critical. I want you to think about this, folks. Not why did you hire the other person, but why did this person? We know you like the person you hired. How do we know that? Because you hired them. It's obvious you found them to be an attractive candidate. The focus of strategic disposition codes is why you didn't hire this person, and when you're 2 years removed and you don't remember, you're not in that role. And then finally, who made the decision, so we can backtrack to that if we need to defend it. If we do this right, it's going to position you to defend your hiring decisions years later, and it's especially helpful when we're undergoing these type of audits or investigations and we don't have the decision makers in the same role. So let me start with bad disposition codes. Then we're going to look at good ones. Better qualified applicants selected. Every one of you. I defend these all day, every day in audits and in EOC investigations. By the way, it's not just OFCCP. EOC just settled with, I think it was Dillard's department store, literally announced today for hiring and promotion issues for African Americans where the employer could not explain why they weren't qualified, not why the people who were qualified were. Folks, when you use better qualified candidates selected, you're talking about the person who you hired, not about the qualifications or lack of those for the people you didn't. Not chosen. Some of these dispo codes that you have, I call, they're like Captain Obvious type of dispo codes. I know the person wasn't chosen. That's why we have to defend this in an audit. Interviewed, screened as a dispo code. What this seems to imply is, well, something must have been concluded in the interview by the interviewer, and it must be legitimate. They got to meet the person, so there must be good reasons. That's not enough. Applicant disqualified. Not enough. We need more. And then often we have no disposition reason. It should be a requirement in your ATS system that before you finalize, I like to say before you send out a job offer, you should be finalizing in this requisition all your disposition codes. It's just good discipline, or good, think of it as good requisition hygiene for us to have to fill out our dispositions before we send out a job offer. That will impose some discipline and some sequence in the process. What are good disposition codes? Well, remember, we want to know when they fell out, why they fell out, and who made the decision. Look at this resume screen. I don't mind you using better qualified candidate, but I want you to give more information. I will tell you this, I've defended better qualified candidates as a dispo code for the last 26 years. And what I've learned doesn't make a difference. The industry doesn't make a difference. The job. The bottom line here is virtually all better qualified candidate reasons fall into one of three reasons about 99+% of the time. It has to do with your industry or your overall experience, job experience, your job stability, and your education. I want you to notice with better qualified candidate that I have here, look at the suffix for each one of them. When you have better qualified candidate in your system, my recommendation is you have a drop-down list. The recruiter or whoever it is who's making the decision or is putting in the dispo code, when you hit better qualified candidate, there should be a drop-down list that says, and further, I have to pick one of these, better qualified candidate, because this candidate did not have as much industry experience, or they didn't have job stability, or they didn't have the education we were looking for. The bottom line here is, folks, if you think of this in terms of when did they fall out, why did the candidate, why were they rejected, and who did it? Never think of it in terms of why did we select the other person. We're going to be defending why we didn't select this person. If you do this right, you can make a simple pivot in your dispo codes in a way that puts them on a strategic footing and allows me and you to defend the decisions that were made 2 or 3 years ago without having to talk with the people who made those decisions. So just key takeaways here. OFCCP in the last couple of years has absolutely found an effective entry point through your larger job groups and have record-setting results to show for it. This has resulted in this job group creep that now is being used to find pay and hiring big multi-million-dollar settlements. And the key is these are avoidable deep dive investigations. I want you as a takeaway for your upcoming affirmative action plan year, let's review your job group structure and see what we can do to make strategic refinements to it. I mentioned earlier, let's make sure we're thinking of our outreach and recruitment efforts as assessing the effectiveness of them, not just the push out. And then finally, let's review your disposition codes and make them strategic. And that's all we have. And Rathin, I know that I left just a few minutes here, so I don't even have questions up, by the way, because I'm in slideshow mode. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them for the next few minutes. And if there's anyone who has questions that we don't get to, you have my contact information here on the final slide, and feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to give you answers. So Rathin, back to you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. Again, I think it's really, there is not much to say except that fantastic presentation. You have covered the life cycle and the points of, where I think our employers need to be prepared, from recruiting to disposition code and everything in between. We don't seem to have a lot of questions here, but as you said, if there are, they can definitely reach out to you directly. They can reach out to me, as well as, we would send out the presentation and an opportunity to share their experience and questions in our follow-up communication. So if you don't have anything, thank you for attending. And once again, many thanks to Mickey. This is such a wonderful presentation. I mean, literally, there's so much to learn, and your presentation style is, as always, engrossing.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Rathin. And this is always, we've made this, I think, an annual or even semi-annual tradition. I enjoy this with your organization, and I know a lot of the people who attend on your end. So it's always a pleasure on my end. Since we have 1 minute left, let me mention it if I can. At the beginning of this year, just in time for COVID to hit, by the way, I started my own firm, and it's been a wonderful experience and a wild ride during this first year, but it's been fantastic. As you go into your next year, folks, and you're preparing AAPs or doing pay equity or responding to OFCCP, this is what I do. And if there's an opportunity to chat with you, and if there's some way for me to help you, I would love to. But thanks for listening in for the last hour, and I hope this was helpful. And if you need any follow-up information, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to chat.
Thank you. And that concludes our webinar today. Stay tuned for the next webinar, and have a safe and healthy fall and for the upcoming winter. The COVID situation is apparently again getting worse, so stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.